Hey there, lovely people. Welcome back to another Writing Tip Tuesday. I'm Sammy, and I'm a writer who likes to help other writers become better writers. This week, I want to talk to you about how to come up with ideas, because while some of us may have one thing that we really want to work on, and that's been something that's been clouding our mind for a long time, others may be wanting to do more short stories, and coming up with shorter pieces may be a little bit more effort than coming up with one really long story to put into a book. Now, the benefit of being somebody who has been to college is that idea development is something that's super important when you're taking a lot of writing courses, especially if you're taking multiple different courses at the same time that all have different story-based requirements or different things that you're focusing on. And a lot of different professors have different methods for helping their students develop ideas to practice on for their class. So I'm going to start with the things that I currently use to develop my ideas and come up with different things to think about to develop into a story. So the most common thing that I use are dreams. Dreams that I've had, a lot of them will be just like an image or a feeling or like a place that I remember from a dream. And they're just like fragments of images that I start to think about more. And by thinking about them more, I think like, what kind of person would be in here? What would cause someone to feel this feeling? And like asking myself those questions turns it into a story. So like, for example, I once had a dream that there was like an orange colored sky and a walkway with fences, really tall fences on the side. And then there were people who were all dressed the same walking through these fences. I have no idea where this image came from, but from there I started to think about like maybe a dystopian situation. Maybe we address like the prison system that we have in America, where it's the only way to legally use slave labor, and then dig into that a little bit more. And I came up with this idea that had like a sister who took the place of her younger brother in this prison system. And I haven't figured out more of it, because that's just what I've gotten from the dream, waking up, writing down what I remembered, asking myself questions, and then going. But I know that that's a story that I would like to write, that I have some factors for, but still need to explore more. I know that the characters are a brother and a sister. I know that the brother is the younger character. I know that it's a dystopian situation, and I know that there's a prison system. And that came from this image of like orange clouds and tall fences and like people walking. And I have no idea where that image came from, but it could turn into something. So I wrote it down and I kept hold of it for when I have a chance to explore it more. So keeping those like super weird images that you get from dreams that just sort of like stick with you, or like having people that show up in your dreams that you're like, why would that person be there? Why would they have said what they said? Write down the really weird things that you remember from your dreams, because sometimes they can lead to really awesome, really great storytelling. My feature film that I wrote in college literally started because I had one mental image of somebody pickpocketing my backpack on a train. And that mental image led to a full ready to be submitted movie. Another way that I get ideas is from reading. And I know what you're gonna say. You can't get ideas from reading books, then you're stealing. I'm not taking the ideas from, oh, this story had a cool premise, I'm gonna do that. I'm taking the ideas from, this book gave me a lot of questions. I have questions about situations that were addressed in this book, and I would like to think more on those situations. So for example, when I talked about The Blackmailer's Guide to Love, I was really interested in the fact that it's a story told about a married couple. It's a love story told about a married couple. And you never see love stories that are not at the very beginning of a relationship, maybe with an epilogue where they're like happy and together. It's very hard to create conflict when you've already been established in a relationship. And since I've read that book, I've been thinking about how I could write a story that addresses a happily together couple. How can you put their love that they already have into an engaging story? Because a lot of romance genre books, their conflicts come from like the will they, won't they. Every one of them has that moment where they break up, and then that's the thing that happens and they have to come back together. And it's so repetitive, that that's what people expect. But how would you do that? How would you be able to tell an engaging story? What conflict could you bring up if you have a happily married, happily long-term couple? What could you create that would have the same impacts? So I've been thinking about that because of reading, and that's just a question that came up because I read a book. And a lot of stories will have something where I'm like, what if that? And I try to keep track of those, but sometimes they just come and go. So keeping like a notebook for ideas or like brain dumping thoughts that you have, those kinds of things could be super helpful for coming up with ideas, because if you have like questions that you would like to answer or you would like to see answered, which is a different thing, then there's always the potential to create a story out of those things. Another way that I have come up with story ideas is through situations that I'm dealing with in real life that I don't necessarily know how to emotionally process myself, or that are not something that I can address. So if a friend tells me a story about a friend of theirs, I don't know that friend. I can't offer that friend any advice. I can't see how that situation plays out. So instead of me just like turning it around in my head or pestering my friend to tell me what happened with their friend, it's a potential for a story. It's a what if question. I have a premise, but I don't have all of the facts, so I make up the facts to satisfy my curiosity. I've done this with news stories. I've done this with personal things that I've not known how to process. I've done this with like general bad vibes, just like something's off and I don't know what it is, but I know it's something involving XYZ, and then I make a story about XYZ that involves a character that is not me and like how they handle it. Another way that I come up with story ideas is by watching movies. I've noticed a lot lately. It's been very upsetting that a lot of the movies that I've seen have not paid any attention to the actual story. They pay a lot of attention to the spectacle. They're like, ooh, pretty colors, ooh, fun explosions, ooh, all of this, all of that, but they don't give the characters any reason to do what they're doing, or they don't explore why the characters do what they're doing. They don't let the characters be people. They just sort of make them do what they want them to do, and that's very upsetting to me. I really care about why the people are doing what the people are doing, and it's not something that movies care about a lot lately. So if I have a movie that really upsets me because they don't dive into the characters' motives and whatever, if I can come up with a motive for that character, I can apply that character's motive to another character in another situation. And that is something that has inspired me a couple of times. It doesn't usually end up being something good that I feel great about. It's usually like out of spite, but there have been a couple of ideas that I've come up with because of that lack of attention to detail in movies lately that I can turn into a story or a short story myself and just get it out of my system. What if questions are also a really good way to come up with story ideas. I think a really good example of that would be The Art of Racing in the Rain, which you can definitely see the concept coming to be, starting with, what if this story was told from the dog's perspective? The plot points in that story, I'm sure, came from some other kind of inspiration, but the way that it's told, the point of the story comes from the fact that it's told by the dog. So what if the story was told by the dog creates a different type of story than if the same story was told from, like, let's say the daughter's perspective or the main guy's perspective. It creates a totally different world and a totally different story entirely because it's told by the dog. So I think that's a good example of a what if. And there's just like general what if questions that you can explore and just put people into and see how they handle those. And that can be something that relates to something that you have in real life, because what if questions can directly relate to things that you're dealing with in real life. That's something that ties into a lot of these methods, but it's still totally viable by itself. So those are the methods that I use regularly, and there are some methods that don't necessarily work really well for me, but were taught in classes that I was in, so I'm happy to share those as well. For one, my screenwriting teacher would have us look at a painting, typically one with a person in it or a setting, something that looked like it was in motion. Then we would come up with what happened right before that painting's moment, right after that painting's moment, or what led all the way through. And that was always really interesting because if you have a class of students that are all looking at the exact same painting, you would get every single person would tell you a different story, and you could come up with something totally different every time you look at the same painting, and something totally different every time you look at any painting. So that could be something that if you're more of a visual person, but you have a hard time conjuring an image yourself, like I do with the dream situation, then you can look at paintings or photographs or whatever artistic form and put details around that. Something a playwriting teacher of mine did, we found news articles or like blog titles and stuff, and we took the information from that and made it into a play. I wrote a play about birds getting drunk on fermented berries in Minnesota because that happened and I thought it was hilarious, and I made it this whole thing. I'm actually working on revising it right now. It's a really great exercise to just like come up with something that you would not naturally think of. And there's so many different places, like local news. Local news is always different than national news because national news is usually like sad and local news tries to like build a community. So looking at local news for places that you don't live and you have no connection to might be an interesting way to do that. Looking at blogs, reading the really long blog before the recipe on somebody's recipe blog and seeing like what they're talking about may inspire you to write a situation. And it's a really fun exercise in general. I do remember that the class had a good time with that one, and I got something that I really am proud of the concept for out of that exercise. In one of my classes that touched on poetry, we took a line of a poem that you had read for the first time and made that the title of a piece while you were working through the draft. And while it doesn't have to have anything to do with the poem, it has to have something to do with that one line of the poem, and you tie everything back into that like it's the title. That is a very interesting way. I don't personally like to work from like making a story based on a title. I'd like to make the title based on a story, and I actually have a really hard time with titles, but that's something that could be really interesting if you're somebody who likes to have more of a prompt, but not something that's like, someone walks to the grocery store, what do they see on their way? Having a line of poetry that stands out to you as your title can lead to a more interesting exploration of your story. And making it into a first draft, you're gonna just sort of explore things that you might not have if you started with like the people in it or the place where it's taking place or anything like that. If you start from the energy of the story and go into the details afterward, you may end up with something you might not have naturally developed otherwise. My last tip from a class that I took is from my intersection of identities class, and we did a short story that was based off of a story that you've heard told a lot of times. And that's usually something that you've heard told from like a familial perspective, like a family history story that you've heard however many times. And instead of just retelling it the way that you've heard it, you tell it based on who you are and how your identity interacts with that story. Like if you have a grandparent that tells you about being in a war and like how their best friend died and they're homophobic but you're gay, and you write that story again, you tell that story in a different way because you're telling it from your perspective rather than from their perspective, and they're direct opposites, you end up with a totally different story and your identity creates a new perspective. And it's a really interesting activity to do, especially if you come from a family that tells the same stories over and over and over again. I did mine on my grandmother for that exercise from on my dad's side because I never met her, and all of what I know about her is via stories that I've been told, and I've been told a lot of the same stories over and over again, and every time I'm told them something changes. So changing it myself made it a little bit more interesting, and creating that connection with my identity into her identity, even though I never knew her, made an interesting progression. So that might be one to explore. But that's all that I've got for you today. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you learned something from it, if you're gonna try out one of these techniques, let me know how it goes. I'm really excited to hear like if you guys try out a technique and it really genuinely helps you come up with a new idea. If you don't want to miss any of my uploads, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell next to it. But I will see you guys with a story study Saturday.